Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Books and Books. I'm Mitchell Kaplan. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. And we are live streaming, so I want to welcome everybody on the internet as well to this event, whether you're watching it now or whether you've waited a little while to watch it. It's always very special to have Jim Hall with us. I don't know how many of you feel this way, but today I was thinking about this event tonight, and if something happened to me today, and it doesn't, normally I don't react this way, but I got really angry and a little bit perturbed. I got a call from a guy, and I get a lot of these calls from a guy who said the following: I've just written a novel in my part-time, in my spare time. I just wrote a novel. And, I'm wondering if you can find me an agent. I probably get 30 or 40 calls a month, but I haven't quite gotten someone to say that they wrote a novel in their spare time. After I sort of said to him, I sort of want to be a heart surgeon in my spare time. Do you think that would work? He then, I guess he didn't get it, because he then said to me, he said, I also think my story is good enough to become a Lifetime TV show. How do I get that made? And I finally said, look, I think you got a lot of work to do. And maybe not seem naive and go ahead and study and figure it out and all of that. But I got off the phone and I began to really think about evenings like tonight with guys like Jim Hall and Les Standiford and Deborah Dean and other writers who work really hard at their craft and who spend their whole lives perfecting and exacting what they do. And I don't think we appreciate it enough. I mean, those of you who went to the book fair, there were over 400 writers there who take what they do extremely seriously. And I know all of us in this room take it very, understand that. But I think a lot of people have this weird idea that because they can write with a pen or they can type, that they can create something masterful. And that's really not the case. And I just thought I'd get that off my chest. The other thing I'm going to get off my chest, actually, also, is how many of you remember the Bakery Center, which is in South Miami? Well, you're not going to believe this. I was driving by the Bakery Center tonight with my windows down, and I smelled burnt toast. I swear to God, it actually was true. I had the ghost of the Bakery Center was coming back at me. But let's get on with tonight's festivities. And to introduce our guest, it's really a pleasure to bring up a very close friend of all of ours, someone who's the director of the creative writing department, the MFA program at FIU. His name is Les Standiford. He's written so many books I can't even begin to recount all of them. But I do want to tell you about a book that he is working on, and I don't think it's a secret, but he's been flying out to Los Angeles to do a lot of really cool research on Mulholland, and he's going to do the story of Los Angeles before the Chinatown story, or what led to the Chinatown story. And I know that all of us are looking forward to that greatly, and I hope you'll give him a warm welcome. Les Standiford.
Thank you very much, Mitchell. Always a pleasure to be here at what I like to refer to as the temple to the book. When I finally caught up with James W. Hall, he was drinking beer with an alcoholic Labrador retriever named Travis McGee in a ramshackle joint just outside Salt Lake City, Utah, drinking the heart right out of a fine fall afternoon. I've been looking for you quite a while, I said when I joined him at the bar. Call me Ishmael, he said, for he was a poet then. Look, I'm not kidding. Here he is in full poetic splendor. Thus, in 1970, began? Well, more or less, courtesy of that lift from the beginning of the novel, The Last Good Kiss by our old pal James Crumley. That's how it began. It began a fine friendship of some 40 years now. We went on to graduate school together at the University of Utah and split up for a while, only to reunite here in Miami in the mid-1980s, where we'd shaken off some of our metafictional pretensions and were trying to write novels that people might actually want to read. It's one of the great satisfactions of my life. After all, you like to think that you're correct when you spot someone you think has special talent. To watch Jim's career flourish as it has from the time of the publication of Under Cover of Daylight. There it is. Here's that other photograph. Until today. A couple of dozen more books, a passel of kudos, including the Edgar Award from the Mystery Writers of America, and a special place in the hearts of Florida readers who know that above all, and whatever goes on in the next one, he is going to do this place proud. He's here with his 13th installment in the trials and travails of the iconic Keys loner Thorn. It's called Going Dark, which Publishers Weekly called outstanding, both thoughtful and white-knuckle tense. I agree with PW. And in fact, I think that this is one of Jim's very best. It is a pleasure to have been watching him get better and better all these years. Please join me in welcoming James W. Hall.
Wow, get this stuff out of here. Sorry, Mumbai. I left for a second. Whoa. Thank you all very much for coming. So many different parts of my life are represented here. My tennis life is well represented. My construction life, my medical life, my financial life, my neighbors are here. I love my neighbors dearly. It's what, and my ex-neighbors still follow me around. And then there's all these other people I don't know, obviously riffraff, homeless people that have wandered in to get some air conditioning and free wine. But you're welcome to be here, and thank you for coming. Yeah. I think I want to thank Les once again. I don't know how many this is total that he has introduced me over the years. Many times. It's got to be in the multiple dozen times. And they're never the same. I've never heard that one before. I hope I never hear it again. But I have to say, normally I'm acerbic and critical and mean-spirited, cranky. But for this moment, I just want to say these two guys over here standing next to each other, Mitch and Les, have done more in their different ways to build the book literary community in South Florida than any two other people I can think of. Because we all know what Mitch has done, but what Les has done in starting the program at FIU and bringing in this incredibly good faculty and running this program in a way that nobody hates each other, everybody gets along. We all want to stay here indefinitely, we hope, or they hope. I've retired. That didn't exist before Les came. I could never have done that. I can do certain things, but I couldn't have done that. Les did that beautifully. He continues to run it beautifully. It's really had an enormous impact on American literature. Richard Blanco is one of our students right at the inauguration. Dennis Lehane is one of our students. Mystic River, et cetera, the new Travis McGee. We've got an enormous number of wonderful graduates who've gone on and done great things because Les was here and steered us in the right direction. So these two guys over here are very, very important. And with that, I'm going to sit down. That's my dose of earnestness for the evening. There's some new people here, so maybe I can tell an old story. Oh, goody. Well, you know, one of the good things about my demographic is that you forget that you've heard this story. In fact, I found out recently one of the good things about my demographic is that people forget they actually bought this book, so they buy it a second time. That's really good, you know? But the bad thing about my demographic is, you know, we're all on the same trip together, and it's not too much longer here. We're all going dark. Sorry. Paul Levine's not here, is he? Good. I thought he was. He said he was going to come and heckle me, and I'm glad he didn't, because then I don't have to say these things that I was going to say that were very mean. Back to him. I wanted to talk a little bit about Thorn. This is the guy that Les mentioned that I started with in 1986, and here I am. This is the 18th novel and the 13th with Thorn in it. I have to take a book off from Thorn every once in a while so he can make new friends, because all of his friends died in the previous book, except for Sugarman, who's just barely hanging on. So that accounts for the 6 or 5 that were not Thorn books. But the problem that I have with Thorn is expressed kind of very well. I don't ordinarily read from reviews, but this review came out yesterday, and I thought it was very interesting. This is the end of the review. There are undoubtedly sticklers for detail out there for whom suspension of disbelief is impossible. They are likely reading Mr. Hall's Thorn novel screaming, "He's got to be pushing 60. How can he possibly pull this shit off time after time?" After all, Thorn was 35 when he debuted in 1987's Under Cover of Daylight. In the non-fictionalized world where sticklers live, that would make Thorn 61, give or take. Well, Mr. and Ms. Stickler, allow me a question of my own. Was Clint Eastwood any less badass as Will Mooney in 1992's The Unforgiven, in which he would have been 62, than he was in Rawhide's Rowdy Yates in 1965 at the age of 35? I couldn't have said it better. That's great. Shelve your disbelief and dive headfirst into going dark. Thorn may take a few more lumps and suffer the aches and pains a lifetime of brutality can inflict on a body. The only thing that hasn't slowed is his wit. But make no mistake, he can still fight and fornicate like the champ of Florida crime fiction that he is. The fornicate part, I'd like to address briefly, because Kirkus or somebody, one of those early publication reviews said something about extraordinary or exciting sex scenes, which I think is great. I was reminded of this line by Charlie Parker. You know Charlie Parker, jazz. If you don't live it, it won't come out your horn. That's it. Think about that. That's it. Moving right along. One of the difficulties that I have, in addition to each time with the books coming up with some new way to get Thorn engaged and out of his sanctuary and isolation, is that a lot of the the ground in Florida is already well covered by the other writers who followed me and imitate me and rip me off. And I've done my share of ripping off of John Dee and so forth before me, but now there's so many people working the same territory that it's hard to find anything that hasn't been touched already or written about in some way. So the thing that I bring to the table, I think, is some language interest, because I'm interested in language and the way language sounds. I always have been. And to me, I can write about the same things that X can write about, but it's different. Even though the object is the same, the thing is different. So I'm going to read a passage in just a second, but first, before that, I want to just give you a little background on what this book is about. I met, through a series of very lucky accidents, including John Whitty, who's sitting here in the front row, introduced me to a guy named Joe Wasilewski, who's a biologist, a well-known biologist in South Florida. He works for Florida Power and Light. You may have read about him. He's the guy that brought crocodiles in the cooling canals in Turkey Point from the endangered status to merely threatened now, which means they went from the hundreds to the thousands in numbers. And one person was responsible for that. That guy, Joe Wasilewski, took me out on his airboat in the cooling canals one afternoon, and I looked at what he does, and which is, go out in these. It sounds very antiseptic and sterile, cooling canals, but it actually looks like the Everglades. You're out in the Everglades, you see all these birds, crocodiles, alligators, wonderful fish, extraordinary birds, and then you continually turn around and there's the hulking nuclear power plant, which even though there's 160 miles of cooling canals, you never really can escape that presence of this cooling canal. When I was on the boat with him that day, I realized this is what this book is about. This is what the new book is going to be about. Crocs and nukes. I told my wife, Evelyn, this, and she said, "You're going to write about shoes?" I'm sorry. I know, I'm making that up. It's my job! Everybody is, it's my job. Come on, give me a break. I think it's funny. It's a good line, right? I shouldn't drop that out, right? It doesn't reflect well on Ellen. It's not true, but still it's a good line. Anyway, so, William Carlos Williams said this great line that sort of answers the question that you get asked in writing in situations like this a lot, which is where to get your ideas. He had this great line, which is, "No ideas but in things." Only things is what people write about. That's where ideas come from. In my case, it was Crocs and nukes. Those are the things that I'm writing about in this book. Okay. I wanted to read something from the book to give you a sense of what it's about. And this is one of those things that I mentioned before that everybody is writing about these days because it's in South Florida and we can't help it. Thorn this is sort of the, he's been called into action, precipitated by this son that he didn't know he had, that he discovers he had in the previous book, Dead Last. And now this son seems to be calling out for his help in this book. And it makes Thorn go to this very isolated island that's out in the South Biscayne Bay. And there are a lot of twisty canals. It's right across from Turkey Point. Turkey Point is in the distance from this. And he gets Thorn, in his haste, doesn't pay attention to what he's doing, and he runs into this very simplistic booby trap that someone has set up next to this island. And his engine is destroyed, basically, and he's caught in this net and away from shore where he wants to be. So that's his predicament at this moment. And this is very early in the novel, so I'm not really giving away too much about the story. So that was it. Once he managed to cut away the mesh of the net that he was caught in, he'd have to tear open the engine and track down the issue. But it sounded serious, a blown piston ring or head gasket, neither of which he was equipped to repair, which left nothing to do but swim to shore. He stepped around the console and surveyed the cove. At the edge of the sandy beach, a two-tiered wooden storage rack held a half-dozen kayaks painted a dull primer black. As he was turning away, Thorn saw an odd shape slung out on the sand. He stopped, came forward, stepped up on the casting platform, and squinted to be sure. Yes, basking in the sun on the beach was an enormous serpent, a healthy Burmese python. Its head and a couple of feet of its body were exposed, but its hindquarters were hidden in the shadows of the foliage. It was as thick as a goalpost, sleek and shiny, with blotches on its dark skin outlined in a shade of gold like drizzles of butterscotch, ghastly and gorgeous. For the last few years since pythons first appeared in the Everglades, they've been devastating the ranks of foxes, raccoons, possums, and marsh rabbits, and multiplying so fast they'd begun to push east into the western suburbs of Miami, while others headed west into the outskirts of Naples and Fort Myers. Though these days they were being relentlessly hunted by airboat sportsmen and park rangers and herpetologists, their population was still exploding into the thousands. Folks in the upper Keys had thought they were safe from the invasion because the big snakes didn't tolerate salt water for sustained periods, and a lot of salt water buffered the Keys from the freshwater Everglades. But recently, biologists discovered the pythons had found a clever way to cross those barriers. By moving from one brackish estuary to the next, they'd managed to hopscotch south to the Keys, where now they'd taken up residence and were snacking on local egrets, possums, and feral pigs. Even a few deer had been found digesting in the bellies of some larger specimens. Thorn's arrival in the cove had stirred the water, and ripples were sloshing against the sandy shoreline. That small disturbance roused the snake from its Sunday's slumber. It lifted its head, swiveled it side to side, absorbing the situation. Then the python began a slow glide out into the sunlight, coming and coming till its length was fully revealed. 15 feet, maybe longer, well over 100 pounds. And it continued to slide forward as to the shoreline, where it nosed into the water and disappeared into the basin to investigate. Thorn kept watch to see where the big snake was headed, but lost it in the dark water. Maybe he'd spooked it, sent it off to a more secluded spot. He peered into the water for a few minutes more, but saw no sign of it. From the bow of his skiff, the shore was a good 40 feet away, an easy stone's throw, a half-minute's swim. But to be sure the snake was busy elsewhere, he opened his tackle box and gathered a handful of split shot, then tucked the pry bar. He's carrying a crowbar in his, for reasons that you don't need to know, but it plays a role. He tucked the pry bar in the waistband of his shorts. He stepped up onto the bow deck and edged forward until the toes of his boat shoes jutted beyond the rub rail. He looked across at the closest spit of sandy beach, chose the shortest angle. He slung a few of the lead weights to the far corner of the basin, then waited a few seconds, plunked 2 more into the widening riffles of the first splashes, then sailed the last handful into the same splatter. Enough of a distraction to give him a decent head start. Though he didn't believe he had anything to fear, surely the snake had been dining well enough on the shorebirds and small game living on Prince Key, which is this place where he is, and would have no interest in anything as large and unfriendly as Thorn. He saw its sinuous length gliding just below the surface, heading towards the ripples, which put the big snake about as far from Thorn as Thorn was from shore. He took hold of the pry bar. Is anybody queasy about snakes and this sort of thing? Well, sorry. Leaning forward, he drew a quick breath and dove. He swam as smoothly as his body allowed, slicing and pulling himself forward with his arms, but not kicking, even though he knew this attempt at stealth was silly, for surely the python had registered his entry into the basin, knew instantly that this alien chunk of protein was out of its element. He was well aware of the creature's method of attack. He'd encountered one earlier that summer warming its cold blood on his dock. Because it was an invading species decimating native wildlife, Thorn had no qualms about murdering the thing. A single machete blow had decapitated the 6-footer, and he'd stored its chunky head on ice until Sugarman's daughter came down for their next scheduled visit. That weekend, he presented the trophy to 14-year-old Janie Sugarman, a devoted naturalist, and just as he'd thought, Janie was thrilled at the chance to dissect the python's head and study the structure. They'd spent the afternoon at Thorn's fish-cleaning bench, using one of his fillet knives to dismember the creature's skull and examine its strange, hingeless jaw that allowed the python to swallow prey 5 times the diameter of its head. Its incisor teeth were about a half-inch long and curved inward, not meant for chewing, but only to lock onto the flesh of its prey, hold it in place, while the supple trunk wrapped around its quarry and crushed the life from it. Halfway across the basin, swimming smoothly, he felt a brush against his ankle. He accelerated, began to flutter kick in earnest, and lifted his head to check his progress. He was a few seconds offshore when he crashed against the submerged branch. It thumped so hard into his ribs it felt like a short left hook from a pissed-off welterweight, a serious, breathtaking hurt. Gasping for breath, he halted his stroke, let his legs drop. A mistake. As his feet sank into the mucky sediment, he saw a shadow sneaking toward his right hip and jabbed at it with the pry bar, making glancing contact with its slippery flesh. Then he staggered backwards towards the bank, 20 feet of squashy mush to cross through waist-high water. Up to his thighs in the quicksand, he was struggling toward the soggy bank when he saw the shadow making another approach. He waited till it was at arm's length, then waited a moment more before he slashed, missed, and slashed again. Water splattered, but he struck nothing solid. He felt the silky mass slide against his thigh, heavy and thick and undulating, its slippery flesh coiling around his hips in a loose embrace. Gripping the pry bar two-handed, he aimed its sharp end at the golden brown shine, searching for the head, the vulnerable eyes, but seeing only the endless tail. As far as he could tell, the monster was all tail, all heavy, dark meat, a being whose length had not yet fully arrived. He picked a spot and hacked at the trunk, looping his waist, the massive rubbery bulk of its butterscotch markings, its slow encircling clench, still not seeing the eyes, the head, the face, the mouth, its small brain controlling the instinctive swirl of its body. This creature only knew how to do one thing, a simpleton with a single strategy, to squash the breath from what it desired, and right now it hankered for Thorn. Before he knew it was happening, he was locked firmly. Until that moment, he thought he was moving freely. He believed he was working his way backward up the last 8 or 10 feet of the slushy bank, but when he looked back at the land, it had moved away. He was not just immobilized, he was being towed out to deeper water, coaxed without knowing it. This idiot creature hadn't even bothered to bite and take hold, but just enveloped him slowly without a fight, seducing with its slow embrace. Then he spotted the wedged head moving past and slashed the crowbar's talon with enough force to splinter its skull and liquefy its brains, but his aim was off by an inch, and all he got was another splatter of water. His mind seemed to be clouding. He was now chest high in water and firmly in the grasp of the python, a pressuring hug that was relentless, yet so languorous that he was feeling a dreamy calm, a sense that there was nothing to worry about, a drifting away from the consequences of drifting away. But some dim, bull-headed region of Thorn's brain was still active, enough to absorb the predicament. If he didn't strike a decisive blow soon, his ribs would begin to crack one by one. He drew a cramped breath, hacked at the meaty weight that was hugging him, hacked it again, and once more after that, hitting it finally, making good contact, a goddamn satisfying thunk, getting his aim. A couple more blows bounced off its tough hide, then a couple more. He was breathing hard, but he also knew the snake was hurt. He saw a pale, oily liquid coiling to the surface like wisps of cigarette smoke, and bits and strands of membrane swirling up through the tannic-stained water. Again, he struck at the meat, and this time nailed it good, aiming at the section that was compressing his diaphragm, knowing that an errant blow could skid into his own flesh and might seriously wound him, but he was out of choices. He gouged at this greenish hide, gouged again, and finally the python reached its threshold. It happened fast. In seconds, the water in front of Thorn wrinkled, several small whirlpools gathered and disappeared, and the creature unleashed him and was gone. Thorn staggered backward. He took a breath and another, and the light rose around him. He hadn't realized how deeply he drifted into Shadowland, how close to the end he'd come. He sank one foot into the muck, then sank the other foot, and tore loose the back foot and moved it into the lead. He waded through the gummy sludge, peering up at the dense mangroves and viney tangle of woods, but seeing no sign of any living thing or any movement or sound, just the glop and slop of each step, the sucking bottom that was urging him to stay put and rest. At last he stumbled up the slope of the beach, stood for a moment surveying the basin, then turned halfway around, collapsed, and lay back panting. He stared up at the empty sky, feeling his heart sprinting for some distant finish line. He set the pry bar aside, and after a moment more of rest, forced himself to sit up and held that position for several minutes, his shirt dripping, his legs weak, shoes full of mire, and he looked out at the basin and tried to recall why he'd come to this forsaken place, why he'd been in such a goddamn hurry and so distracted that he'd run afoul of someone's primitive booby trap and ruined his engine in his reckless haste. For a moment, he had no clear memory of his mission, no memory of anything, mind blank, drowsing in the shivery shadow of adrenaline. As he drifted through layers of fog toward the bright surface of wakefulness, struggling to breathe the summertime air, his skin sticky and fitting too tight to his bones, Thorn looked out at the cove, at the secret beach, at the terminus of a labyrinth of twisty canals and creeks and backwaters that had no names and did not appear on any sane person's nautical charts. So, my python is not like their python. My python's bigger and prettier. So, that's it. If you'd like to ask questions now, we have the microphone here. Please. Yes.
Are you going to be doing an audiobook?
There is an audiobook of this. I don't do that.
You could be good.
I could be? Oh, really? Thank you. I guess, but boy, that would be a lot of work and a lot of time. You know, they actually have very good actors who do that now. You know, Will Patton. You know Will Patton. He's done several of my books. He's really, really good. I never have listened to more than just a minute or two, but I've listened to Will Patton do other people's books, and he's great. No, well, thanks. I'm glad you feel that way. Anything else? Yes. Wait. Young woman over there in the corner.
I probably should know this. How did you come up with the name Thorn? And give us a little background on that. I'm sure a lot of people here might know that, but I should know that, and I don't think I do.
No. How did I come up with the name Thorn, and a little background on who this guy was? Well, the simple, stupid answer is that it was inspired by a writer who I liked very much, a California writer named Newton Thornburg, who wrote Cutter and Bone, which was made into Cutter's Way, a very good film. And he wrote the kind of book that I wanted to write, a kind of literary thriller, something that straddled the genres between commercial and literary fiction. And so I just did it in his honor. As I've told this story before, I had no intention of living with Thorn for the next, whatever this has been, 28, 30 years. I would have certainly made him more available to issues, to crimes, like a private detective or something. So because virtually, everybody, like I said, to get him involved in a new story, I have to kill somebody that he loves and cares about. So now, after 30 years, I've killed virtually everyone he's ever come in contact with, and especially the women. Any woman who goes to bed with Thorn is in deep danger, and in a small town like Key Largo, where he lives, that would get around very quickly. Except I mentioned that yesterday. I was in Islamorada doing this in Islamorada yesterday. I said something like that, and a couple of women said, "No, no, no, I would be interested in Thorn." Well, that explains it. I'm going to be the one that doesn't get killed. So, and I was bullied into keeping Thorn alive. I've told this story before, but I'll tell it one more time. I had turned the second book, which was called Tropical Freeze. I had turned that in, I'd actually written 180 pages. I hadn't turned it in yet. About 150 pages or so. And my publisher called me up one day, and Under Cover of Daylight, the first novel, had done much better than they had imagined it would do as a first novel, and had been bought by a paperback publishing company that then pays the hardback, or used to work this way. They would pay the hardback publisher a sum of money, and my publisher in hardback called up to say that the people who are buying the paperback will pay a lot more money if they know that the second book is also about Thorn. And I said, well, it's not. I'm 150 pages into it, and it's not about Thorn. And he said, a lot more money. And you have to, in order to fully understand this story, you have to realize that for the previous 15 years or so, before this phone call, I've been writing poetry. And the way you get paid in poetry is you get 3 copies of the magazine your poem is in. Whoopee. Actually, at the end of my poetry career, I was publishing in Poetry magazine in Chicago that was paying 50 cents a line at the time, 50 cents a line. All of a sudden, my poems got long and narrow. Like, why would you write short, fat poems, So there was this long, narrow phase. But anyway, back to the phone call, the guy said a lot more money, and it didn't compute. I said, I'm sorry. I'm 150 pages into this, and it's not about Thorn. And he said, don't you work on a computer? And I said, yeah. And he said, don't you have find and replace on your computer program? I said, you could see where this is going. He said, just a couple of keystrokes, and the guy's name is Thorn. I said, but it's a different guy. He lives in a different place. He does a different thing. He acts different. He talks different. Everything about him is different. And he thought about it for a second. And he said, well, people change. This was my introduction to the high road of literary culture in the United States, where a lot more money is the ruling theme in everything. And I knuckled under, I'm still writing Thorn. A lot more money is sort of disappearing, but still Thorn is alive, and I've been bullied into it. Years after that, John Whitty and I went to Borneo, and on this research trip to look at orangutans and study about orangutans and this international animal smuggling, which we did. That turned into Gone Wild. and the book Gone Wild. And the same thing happened. I was with a different publisher by that time. She called me up and said, "Oh, this is your best book yet. I love these bad guys. They're really colorful, funny. But couldn't this guy Chip be Thorn?" I said, "Oh, what the hell? Not even finer place. I just made him Thorn, and I didn't make him heroic or anything. I just changed Chip into Thorn and just changed his name." And people still come up to me, years later, and they say, "What was wrong with Thorn in Gone Wild? He didn't act like himself." Well, because he's Chip. He's another guy. A lot more money forced me into making him that guy. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question, Kimberly.
Thank you.
Yes. Anything else? See, this is from teaching college for 40 years. I can take one little haiku of a thought and embellish it into 20 minutes. No problem. That's our job, isn't it? To talk. Anyway.
What did you learn about nuclear power and nuclear power plants?
Well, I learned a lot, and it's all in here. I'm not persuaded that nuclear power is this godsend, for one thing. I mean, everybody talks about, well, it has zero emissions, carbon emissions. That's true at the plant, that it has very low carbon emissions and it has low impact. But everything leading up to coming to the plant has created enormous amounts of dangerous waste. The mining of the uranium to begin with, the transportation, the building of the place itself, which in Turkey Point's case is a great disruption to a very fragile ecosystem. So these guys that in this book, this eco-terrorist group, I'm very much on their side about pulling a stunt to draw attention to the dangers of nuclear power. And there are many more that I didn't go into just now, but are in the book. On the other side of that is I like to charge my iPhone, and you need the power to do that. So what are we going to do? What are the alternatives? And that kind of moral ambiguity is what I'm wrestling with. Part of what I'm wrestling with in this book is Thorn, who has no opinions on anything, really. He lives this primitive, simple life. His electricity is created by a windmill, and he lives in the most Thoreau-like way he can possibly live. So having him engage in this from this primitive mindset is a very refreshing thing for me as a writer. It gets me to expose him to things that otherwise we would all seem very cynical about, and we already know all this stuff. But Thor doesn't know any of this stuff. He doesn't know why anybody wants a cell phone. Why would anybody want that? Why would anybody want all this stuff that other people have? So that's what keeps me interested in this guy, is that he's able to speak for the Gandhi who died with a loincloth, bifocals, and a pair of sandals. There's something beautiful about that to me.
We sell bifocals right outside.
Anything else? Yes.
Wait.
Excuse my laryngitis. You've been writing about Thorn for 28 years.
Yeah.
Is it important to know anything about him before picking up this book, or can you read this book without any prior knowledge?
Yes, you can. I try to write the book so you can come in at any place, and you don't need all this big background. I do these sort of boilerplate paragraph summaries of who Thorn is, who these characters are. It's sort of what Travis McGee, you would read that same boilerplate paragraph or two in all the John D. MacDonald novels about Travis McGee, that he's a salvage operator, that when his bank account gets low, then he goes into action again, and blah, blah, blah. So that little paragraph for my regular readers is no big deal. It's not like a waste of time, but it's all you really need to know to get into each new book, I hope. That's my intention anyway.
How about elaborating on Sugarman, where he came from, and how you got him involved in this?
I'm really not sure about Sugarman. Sugarman is his African-American friend who is a blended, from a blended background, a Norwegian mother and a Rastafarian father. And the people that I knew when I was writing Undercover Daylight in the 80s, early 80s, there were people in my world that were like that. There were people like Thorn. The guy across the street from me was very much like Thorn. And I kind of copied his world, his life. And other people that I met in my life there were of these very interesting amalgams of culture and background and a lot of Caribbean influence. And it's just, the other issue is you've got this loner, but there's nothing more boring than having your hero sit in a bathtub thinking, you know. And you've got to have the character interacting with somebody. So I had to invent someone who was his friend, and a plausible relationship between the two of them. Sugarman's very rational, very orderly, plays by the rules, very, by the book guy that's part of me, the Boy Scout part of me. And then there's the other side. The Thorn side is the impulsive, spontaneous, reckless side. And putting those two different kinds of characters together in the same story allows me to do a lot of things that I couldn't do otherwise. If you have just a regular detective who's logically figuring out X, Y, and Z, yeah, and my brain doesn't work that way. I don't I don't mind those stories, puzzle stories, riddle stories, but I'm not very good at those things myself. So, anything else?
Well, Jim, thank you so much for a great evening.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you, Mitch.
We're going to do the signing over here.
All right.
And thank you all on the internet for watching. Those of you on the internet, if you want to call in, you can call in, and Jim will sign a book as long as he's here. He'll even personalize it for you.
Even later.
And all of you,
Imagine, this is the first time in 30 years we ever started on time. It's because the internet is making us. Bad internet.
Well, also, we have Jim's books up front. We have his backlist, so feel free to buy as many as you'd like, and Jim will sign
It
them
is
for
Christmas.
you right here. Thank you all.